I am joined today by a great friend of the channel who was there right at the beginning. I spoke to this incredible man. We figured about 6, probably 7 years ago, right at the beginning of my channel. Back in 2016, I think we last spoke. And I'm so excited to sit down and talk with him again and catch up on what he's been up to all these years. And we're going to be touching on some new and exciting projects that he's had coming our way the last couple of years and has got coming our way over the next couple of years as well. He is, of course, the wonderful Didier Guez. He is a Disney historian extraordinaire, has written some of my absolute favourite Disney history books, and constant great stream of titles coming from not only him but his contemporaries that he's been working with at the Hyperion Historical Alliance as well. And I'm so excited to welcome him back to the channel. Didier, how have you been?
I've been great. Thank you so much, Dave. It's such a pleasure to be back.
Yes, it's great to speak with you again. We have kept in touch over the last few years, but we haven't sort of found time to kind of catch back up on the channel. And I'm sure, especially people who've been following my channel for all these years, will be excited to see you back here again. I do occasionally get people write in saying, "Oh, can you speak to Didier about his latest volume?" The last time we spoke, I believe it was for the second volume in your Disney's They Drew as They Pleased, the hidden art of the Disney eras. And I think we spoke for volume 2, and then we spoke for volume 3 as well, if memory serves correct. Since then, you published the remaining 3 volumes, which is incredible because I remember when we spoke, you were sort of unsure at the time whether you were actually going to be able to get through the entire series of them, but it all happened, and there's 6 wonderful volumes right there that covers the great hidden art of all the great Disney eras, right from the beginning through to sort of about like the 1990s, early 2000s. These are incredible tomes right here. And as always, so appreciative of all the work that you put into this series and all the other work that you do as well.
Thank you so much, Dave. This is so kind.
It's an absolute pleasure, and you also now are working with, if you excuse me one more second, with the Hyperion Historical Alliance, which I'll get you to talk about a little bit in a second. And you've got these wonderful annuals that come out every year. I keep up to date on these, and these are just absolutely incredible. I'll get you to sort of explain away these as well. Can you talk a little bit about your work with the Hyperion Historical Alliance, what you're all doing over there and what your sort of goals are? You're also doing these wonderful monographs as well. We'll be talking about the newest one throughout this interview too.
Absolutely. Let me tell you about the Alliance. So, the Alliance, the idea behind the Alliance was that really Disney historians before 2009 had a tendency to all work a little bit by themselves and not collaborate that much. They would collaborate from time to time, but not that much. And so there were 2 ideas behind the Alliance. The first one is that Disney-related documents preserved by the family of Disney artists uh, were about to really disappear forever because the older the artist the more difficult it is to access that material, and more importantly, the sons and daughters are not always interested, and then the grandsons and granddaughters are often really not interested, and so that material can be thrown into the wastebasket. And in a lot of cases, those are documents like artwork, photographs, written documentation, autobiographical notes, and so on and so forth, that would fill really important gaps in Disney history. And those are documents that are not preserved by the Walt Disney Archives. So the first goal of the Alliance was to sort of organize Disney historians so that we would all work together to try and go and gather those documents and scan them in high resolution. The idea was not to keep those documents, the physical documents, but really to scan those documents so that they could be available for future generations of Disney historians. And so I served as really founder of the Alliance, and now I serve as president of the Hyperion Historical Alliance. But the Alliance is much more than DDAGS. It's a lot of historians, people like J.B. Kaufman, Todd James Spears, Paula Sigmund-Laurie, Mindy Johnson, and so on and so forth. All names that you all know because of all of the books that they have written about Disney history that work together to preserve those documents for future generations of Disney historians. And then at some point we realized, you know what? With all of those documents are preserved really just for limited access by vetted historians, but the general audience, general people that love Disney history, casual Disney fans, and so on, probably would also love to see those documents and to understand what's in there. And so we realized, well, if we do that, we need to do that in an organized fashion and put in context. And that's when the publication project ID started emerging. And we said, well, how do we do that? So we decided to do two things. One was to launch a magazine which would be released on a yearly basis, which is the Hyperion Historical Alliance Annual that you just showed. And there are 4 volumes released to date, and we're working on volume 5, which is going to be released at the end of this year. And those annuals really contain very in-depth essays about a very little known aspect of Disney history. And every historian that writes one of those essays try to go as in depth as possible. And of course, those essays are complete with endnotes that give you a very clear idea of what the source of each piece of information is, because that's also really important. We want to document everything. We want to make sure that future generations of historians can say, well, where does this information come from? Let me go back to the original document and make sure that there was no misinterpretation or that, and they would know exactly how we found the information that we found and that we were presenting those essays. And then the other thing that we did, which had been a dream of mine for 30 years, 40 years, whatever, is to say, well, there are aspects of Disney history that are very niche and that major publishers like Disney Editions or Chronicle Books would never release a book about. And that's because they're too niche and there isn't a big enough audience to make the project viable for a commercial endeavor like Disney Editions or Chronicle Books. But what if through a nonprofit, because the Hyperion Historical Alliance is an official nonprofit, what if we were able to release those niche books? We don't need to make a profit by definition. What if we were able to just break even with those books? Would Disney support us? And the idea was to say we would like to release a series of hardcover monographs, which are basically books about a very specific subject in terms of Disney history, very, very illustrated, fully in color. Would Disney support us with that endeavor? And Disney said yes, we would. We'll do a lot of things for you that we normally don't do, but obviously it needs to be very good. It needs to be very, very well researched. It needs to be authoritative. It needs to be complete, and the material in there needs to be stuff that we haven't seen before, both in terms of information and in terms of illustrations. And we said, yes, this is great. This is exactly what we want to do. And so we started this with the first volume, which I believe was released in 2019, which was the making of Fun and Fancy Free. And Fun and Fancy Free, obviously, is this feature-length animated feature, which has one section about Bongo the bear and a section about Mickey and the Beanstalk. And of course, Charlie McCarthy and Edgar Bergen connecting sort of those segments. And so that was written by J.B. Kaufman, who better than him to write a book about that specific subject. And obviously we know JB through his books about Pinocchio and the making of Snow White, and of course the huge book by Taschen about Mickey Mouse that he co-wrote was David Bernstein. And so he was the first one to write a monograph for the Hyperion Historical Alliance. And the second monograph is the one I released back in 2022, I believe. There was quite a big gap due to the pandemic, unfortunately, and that's the origins of Walt Disney's true life adventures, and I'll talk about that in quite a bit more detail a bit later. And there are quite a few more volumes that are going to be released this year and in the next few years, and we can also talk about that in more detail later.
What you are doing with the Hyperion Historical Alliance is truly incredible. The information you have been able to get out is just awe-inspiring, to put it in the easiest of terms. But yeah, as I said, I have been keeping up on these, and these are just some of the greatest little treasure troves of Disney history. They are I guess you present a number of different articles, sort of on all different facets of Disney history. Some just really, really niche stuff that you never would have thought about. Spotlights on people who have perhaps never had the spotlight before and just sort of really deserve a little deep dive into their life and their history with the company and outside of the company. And then you've got great little spotlights on. There was an article in one of them, was it the music behind The Little Mermaid? So it's more sort of, I guess, less niche things as well. You got a really great collection of different little articles in here that kind of covers the whole spectrum, and I love these, and I love getting my hands on them, and I devour them when they come in. And you have, despite the little break in the pandemic, you've been able to keep up and get volumes coming and flowing. And of course, as you said, the monographs are terrific as well. These are quite large texts, and again, we'll talk more about these, but for those who don't, own any of these, lots of text, lots of pictures, and I'm so excited to see what else you've got coming out for us. But yeah, today we're going to talk predominantly about the latest monograph. As you said, this one came out in 2022 and it focuses on the origins of Walt Disney's true life adventures. I haven't picked up a hardcover copy or a hard copy of the book just yet, but I will be doing that. And you have been gracious enough to send me a digital copy of it so I could read through it, and I'll also show some images and stuff on the screen so those watching can get a little look inside the book as well. Can you walk us through the book, what readers can expect from it, and perhaps for those who are a little unfamiliar with the topic, briefly explain what Walt's True Life Adventures series was?
Absolutely. So the True Life Adventures was a series of documentaries about animals that Walt Disney launched in 1948. And it absolutely revolutionized the art of documentaries about wildlife, the way that today Ken Burns is sort of revolutionizing the art of documentaries about history. Those were screened in cinemas, and they were widely popular. And Walt won a huge number of Academy Awards, Oscars for that series. But the thing is, I had always been intrigued about how this all started, and so it took me years and years and years of research to really finally figure it out. And there were quite a few coincidences along the way. And so in this volume, and then I'll talk about how it came together. But in this volume, what I do is I go back to the roots of the True Life Adventures. And first, there was this trip in 1938, so 10 years before the release of the the first of the True Life Adventures. There's a trip to Maine, to a forest in the state of Maine, by two people. One was a Disney artist, and the other one was his friend. And they were sent by Walt Disney to Maine to research the setting for Bambi. They were there to shot pictures to provide inspiration and the real color for the backgrounds and the real environment for the artists who were working on Bambi. And so he sent them there, and they spent quite a few months in Maine, and they came back with a lot of photographs and documentation. But you also see when you study that story, that really the setup is very, very similar to the setup that will then be used for the filming of the True Life Adventures. It's the same people who correspond to with that team who's in Maine. They sort of learn the way to work with a team that's really far away, and with means of communication that are not always easy. And what was really great is that I thought, okay, well, this is just going to be a few pages in the book just to provide a little bit of color and background. But then when I started digging into the story, I realized, oh my God, the friend of the Disney artist who went there, the friend of Jake Day, a person called Lester Hall, actually kept a diary of his experience there. And I managed to locate his diary. And so that was really fun. And we learned a lot of details about how the trip happened and what they saw, and when they finally found the place where Bambi would be born, and so on and so forth. And so that was just really spectacular. And the family of Jack Day, the Disney artist, also kept photographs from that trip. And it's literally the first time that anyone outside of the family of Jack Day ever saw those photographs. And so we're finally part of that trip. And it's like taking a time machine and being with them on that trip. So that's the start. And then go from there to the True Life Adventures. Well, it goes through the World War II period. And that's where Walt really learns how to produce educational shorts and features. And obviously you have Victory 3 Air Power, but you have also lots of training shorts for the Army and the Navy and so on and so forth. And he realizes that with his medium, he can do things that others can't really do properly with live action. And so he keeps that idea in mind. And when it's time to really reinvent the studio after World War II, he starts exploring different avenues to really use those new techniques. And so he uses some of those techniques to create commercials for various companies. He uses those techniques to say, well, why don't we try and create some educational shorts for schools? And then he realizes, no, the best way is to create documentaries for now. And documentaries that we can present in cinemas. But he still has no idea what he really wants to do. He doesn't know that what he wants to do are documentaries about animals. And he just knows that there is one subject matter that he finds exciting, which is there is this new frontier in the U.S., which is Alaska, which is this land which is not yet a state. It's still a territory at the time, and he's like a lot of the soldiers going back to the U.S. after World War II are trying to rebuild a life, to rebuild a career, and some of them are excited to go to Alaska. That really again that new frontier at the time. And he's like, there's a subject there. What do I do with this? And so he decides to send two cinematographers, Al and Elma Milot, to Alaska for 1 year, one full year in 1946. It's 1946. The conditions even to go to Alaska are terrible. There are really no amenities where they're going. In fact, at some point, poor Elma Milot, in her diary, she writes, first bath after a month, and she's like so happy that she's back to civilization in Anchorage, Alaska, and is finally able to take a bath again. And so there's this whole story and those adventures of the Milots in Alaska. And there, what's really, really exciting is that I was able to locate their papers, the papers of Al and El Mamilot, which are not preserved at the Disney archives. Part is, but part isn't. And so I was able to dig into all of their correspondence, into all of their notes from that trip, and so on and so forth. Found a lot of photos that no one had seen before. And then at some point I was like, huh, this is weird. It looks as if they had written an autobiography of their time in Alaska during that year. But I could only find like one page here, two pages there, and I was struggling to really find the whole document. And I spoke with their family, and they said, "No, we are aware of this document, but we don't have a copy. We think it's permanently lost." And so when I was contacting one of the museums in, I think it was Anchorage or Fairbanks, I can't remember right now. The curator of that museum says, "Yeah, we have lots of photographs. But by the way, we also have the manuscript of an autobiography. Is that of any interest?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, yes, there's a copy and it survives and I actually can get a full copy of it." And so I got a full copy of that. And obviously a lot of pieces started falling into place because it's like the whole story from start to finish. And so between the correspondence, the notes, the photographs, the autobiography, all of that, and the material I found at the Disney Archives, I was able to finally reconstruct the whole story of that trip in a way that no one knew about before. And so that was really fun. And then, of course, the other thing, and I'll get into a few more details later, but the other thing is when Walt was starting to work on a project, um, not everything that he was working on would be completed. And so he was working on a lot of other projects in parallel that could become true life adventures. And so I found, I think, 10 or 12 abandoned true life adventures that were started around the same time as the Alaska project, but that didn't go anywhere. And so you have the storyboards for those projects, you have concept art for those projects, and you have obviously in-depth information about those projects. So that's the fourth chapter. And then finally, there's the chapter about the actual creation of the first true life adventure. And what's amazing is that the first of the true life adventures is released, Seal Island is released in December 1948. But and the Milots had gone to Alaska in 1946 for 1 year. And during the whole of 1947 and half of 1948, Walt doesn't know what he wants to do with that footage. He has no idea. He's struggling to find coherence. He's trying to find the subject matter. And it's only, I think, in May or June of 1948, so just 6 months before the release, 6 to 7 months before the release of the movie, that Walt realizes, oh, we need to focus on the animals. We need to focus on the seals. And this is what's going to make it work. It's incredibly late in the process. And so that was a huge revelation. And I don't think that anyone knew about that. So that was really, really fun. So that's a bit of an idea of what's in that book. The reality is it took a long time for me to decide to write that monograph. And it took me a long time because for a really, really long time, I didn't have the story. I'd started accumulating a lot of material about the true life adventures and about educational projects at Disney and so on and so forth. But I really didn't have the story. And it was only at the point where I got two historical keys that I realized, oh, now I get it. Now I all of the pieces are falling into place. The first of the two pieces, of course, is access to the collection of papers by Al and El Mamilot, which was preserved in a very, very odd location in the state of Washington. And my good friend, the late Jim Korkis, a fantastic historian, contacted me one day and he said, "Do you realize that this museum has all of the papers of Al and El Mamilot?" He just contacted me about that. And I was so excited. And I'm like, no, I didn't. And I got really excited. And it took about a year or 2 years to get access to everything. And I had a really good friend in the state of Washington who helped me with that and so on. And so that was one part of it. And I realized that there were treasures in there, completely unexploited treasures. So I was like, okay, this is great. This is giving me the first key. Still not enough. There's still something missing. And then I think around the same time, or a little bit before, a little bit after, I stumbled online upon the collection of an illustrator called Holling C. Holling. And when I got copies of everything related to Disney in that collection, and there was a lot of documents related to Disney in that collection, I realized, oh my God, half of this is related to unproduced true life adventures. And I'm finally understanding what I was seeing at the Animation Research Library at Disney when I was conducting some research for They Drew as They Pleased, The Hidden Art of Disney, where I was seeing all of those drawings that didn't make any sense at the time and that were that were drawings that seemed to be live action drawings, but I didn't know what they were related to. There were some animation drawings also, some of which I had seen in Charles Solomon, The Disney That Never Was, which I couldn't understand. And finally, when I got access to those documents in the Holling E.C. Holling collection, I got access to treatments from the unproduced true life adventures. There were some photostats of storyboards and so on, and everything that I'd seen before fell into place. And I was like, "Ha, this is an amazing story. It needs to be told." And it's not the story of the making of Seal Island. It's not the story about the making of the first of the people and places, the Alaskan Eskimo. It's the story about the origins of the True Life Adventures. It's the story about a part of Disney history that no one knew anything about, which is really seminal and critical and just fascinating from start to finish. And there are hundreds of illustrations that no one had seen before that I'm going to be able to use to illustrate that story. And so that's when the project started.
That's incredible. I mean, I've been, I guess I've been interested in Disney history to this level for 15, 16 or so years now, and it fascinates me just how fascinating all these different areas of the company are, and something as niche as a documentary series that I guess a lot of people may not give the credit that it deserves. But I mean, some of these are like 70-plus-year-old films. You don't quite kind of realize how influential they were, how groundbreaking they were, and just how fascinating the behind the scenes stories of them are. And that's always what gets me. And just something as niche as a series of documentary films from an animation studio is just so incredibly fascinating. And I always find it fascinating just how much there is to something. You might just think of it as this small documentary series that the company was putting together, but there's just so much vast history and really exciting and fascinating history that goes into that. Now, this is not a comprehensive look at the True Life Adventures as an entire series. It is, as you say, it's quite literally the origins of the True Life Adventures that we go back to the beginning. But as you were sort of researching the beginning, did you find information on perhaps some of the later features that struck you as kind of interesting or surprising as well?
Oh, absolutely. So I'll share a couple of things with you right now. So the first thing, just to go back to your earlier point about that chapters about World War II, that chapter about World War II. I mean, what's really fun is that you also see how they were using Donald Duck for educational projects in some magazines. You see how they were researching the history of electronics and had quite a few projects on that for television. You really get into a lot of projects with the famous Disney characters that frankly even I knew very little about before researching that project. And of course all of those commercials for which they were creating new characters and so on. And it's just fun to see all of those little bits and pieces that we knew nothing about. The other thing is that yes, I absolutely discovered a lot of material about the next True Life Adventures, and some of it is going to be used in some of my next monographs, and some of it is going to be used in some articles for the annual. But the most interesting element that I stumbled upon, and which is going to be at the heart of another monograph in 1 or 2 years, is the fact that in 1952, around 1951, 1952, Walt was thinking about launching quite a few series of adventures parallel to what he was thinking of adventures in nature. So adventures in nature was really the True Life Adventures. And then he had in parallel the People and Places series, which was another series, obviously, that was of documentaries that was in development at the time. But he was also thinking about a series about adventures in music and a series about adventures in history. And the first one in the Adventures in History series would have been Ben and Me, this wonderful cartoon where Bill Pitt was a big part of the development of that cartoon, the artist Bill Pitt. But what I also discovered is that the artist Tee Hee was the first one to really work on that cartoon. And the Adventures in Music is the series that did not evolve into a full series, but that resulted in Adventures in Music Melody and Toot, Whistle, Plunk, and Boom. And so there is a whole backstory there, which is not just focused on the True Life Adventures, but also on Toot, Whistle, Plunk, and Boom and its making, and all sorts of historical slash folklore related projects that we didn't know much about, and where there's a whole story that started in the 40s until the mid 1950s, which is absolutely incredible to tell. And you have those three series in parallel about nature, about history, about music. And I started digging into all of that, and what I found was completely unexpected, and that's going to be discussed in that monograph called Walt Disney's Adventures in Music, History, and Nature, which I hope will be released in about 2 years or something like that.
What is great about your text is that you are quite literally discovering stuff that has not been published before, stuff that hasn't been seen light of day for 70, 80 years. And it really is incredible. And you're doing the great work in filling in so many holes, and perhaps holes that people didn't know were there to be filled in the first place. And it's incredible for a company like Disney that's been celebrated the 100th anniversary last year. How much new information is still coming to light today? Does it surprise you, the kind of stuff that you're still able to drag up today?
So I'm absolutely stunned by the amount of new material that's coming to light at the moment. And basically, I mean, especially via the work we're doing on the monographs, I have the feeling that the various authors of the monographs are just going to revolutionize Disney history. Uh, we are working right now on quite a few monographs in parallel. I think we have like 10 in progress right now. Because I don't want to talk just about animation, one is about Walt Disney Imagineering. It's a series actually of 4 monographs written by Tom Morris, the Imagineer Tom Morris, who's the Imagineer who supervised the whole creation of Fantasyland at Disneyland Paris. And his series is a series about the origins of Walt Disney Imagineerings, the early days of Walt Disney Imagineerings from the late 1930s to the opening of Disneyland. I think that's the first volume. And then it goes from there. And it's an incredible series where you're going to finally understand the history of Walt Disney Imagineering like never before. He's doing the work on Imagineering that Michael Barrier did on animation or John Canemaker did on animation. And it's absolutely stunning stuff. And I'm like, okay, now I'm starting to understand how this worked, who was who, where they were located at different points in time, what the offices looked like, um, what they were working on, and that illustrated by hundreds of photographs, sketches, and so on that no one had seen before. And it's breathtaking. It's absolutely breathtaking. And then in parallel to that, we're working right now. That's the next monograph that's going to be released. It's called Walt Disney and El Grupo in Latin America. And so that monograph is focused on the 1941 trip to Latin America. And you'll tell me, well, Didier, wasn't there already a book by J.B. Kaufman on the subject and a documentary by Ted Thomas on the subject? And the answer is yes. And the great thing about this monograph is that Ted, J.B., and I are working on this together. And what it is, it's a day-by-day account of the 1941 trip, uh, complete with quotes from the letters that the artists were sending to their families at the time and so on and so forth, but also complete with 240 photographs from the trip that no one had seen before, and that come from private collections, that come from the collection of various of the artists who were on the trip, and so on and so forth. And so it's a 240 page volume with more than 240 illustrations, where you're literally following the artist day by day and understanding exactly what they did day by day. And someone who has seen the monograph and its content and who knows a great deal about Disney history said, oh my God, this is going to change everything. This is just incredible. And so that's really fun. Um, and then you're going to say, well, okay, so what else is there? And I'm like, well, let me give you just two or three other glimpses at things that are gaps that we're filling. One is when we were working on the 1941, the monograph about the trip to Latin America in 1941, I was like, this is interesting. Now I understand a lot better about everything that happened during that 1941 trip. But I also realized that there were trips to Latin America after that. There were a couple of trips to Mexico, and then there were two trips to Cuba. The trips to Mexico were to research the Three Caballeros, and the trips to Cuba were to research an unproduced third Latin American project, and called Cuban Carnival, or they were different names. I'm like, what do we know about those trips? What have we seen about those trips? And I started researching, and I'm like, we don't know much, and we haven't seen very much. And I started digging, and fortunately, I speak Spanish. And so I started corresponding with people in Mexico, and I uncovered something around 100 photographs um, from the trips to Mexico, which are not at the Disney archives and which no one had seen before. And then via Ted Thomas and via another source, discovered a lot of photographs from the trip to Cuba. And so with all of that, there is another volume that will be released at some point in the future, which is going to be Walt Disney and El Grupo return to Latin America, just focused on the trips to Mexico and to Cuba. And it's mind-blowing. And then just two more. One is um, the making of Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Well, we're working on that with my good friend and fellow Disney historian, Jim Holyfield, and he's writing the whole chapter about the actual making of the movie. That movie, Disney started researching almost 10 years before it was released. And so there is a whole story about him first going to Ireland in 1946, and then his artist researching the subject of Darby O'Gill, and so on and so forth. And for almost 10 years, they do that. And we found so many documents that had never been seen before, so many photos of that trip that Walt took to Ireland that no one had seen before. And it was just an absolute revelation. And those are just some of the most gorgeous, most fascinating photos. I found diaries of people who met Walt, and some of those diaries were written in Irish, which is an incredibly difficult language. And I found someone in Finland who's a scholar, an Irish scholar living in Finland for some reason, who translated those diaries for me. And so we finally have like new information that no one. So that's another one. And then finally, what's even more incredible is you'll say, Okay, well, those are really niche subjects, and I understand why we didn't have information about those or why they hadn't been researched. But what's incredible, Dave, is that even on the most obvious subject matter, things where you would say everything must be known about that subject, well, no, that's not true. And let me give you one example. Mickey Mouse. So obviously the most famous of all Disney characters. The 1930s, the golden age of Disney. Everything must have been written about Mickey Mouse in the 1930s, right? Well, wrong. We know a lot about his career in animation. We know a lot about his career in the comics. But what we didn't know much about is the fact that he was on live shows, that he was in radio shows, that he was in parades and not just the Macy's parade, that he was in marionette shows. And we didn't know much about the Mickey Mouse clubs, the original Mickey Mouse clubs from the 1930s. And so, along with the fellow Disney historian Libby Spatz, we started researching that subject of Mickey Mouse in the 1930s outside of the screen and outside of comic books. And we discovered so much new information, uh, so much fascinating stuff, and so many illustrations that no one had seen before, that at first we said, okay, well, this is not just one monograph, those are two monographs. And then we realized, oh my God, there's so much here that this is not two monographs. This is actually three monographs. And so this is going to be a series of three monographs, the first one of which will be released next year, which is going to tell you and show you everything you want to know about Mickey Mouse in the 1930s. And it's going to blow your mind. I mean, he was the biggest star that you can imagine. He was everywhere, from everywhere in the US to everywhere in Canada to everywhere in Europe to everywhere in Australia. And there are incredible stories about Mickey Mouse on stage in Australia in the 1930s, which we'll discuss when the time comes. And you just won't believe your eyes.
Can't wait. They're all just saying it. So that is the best part of about 10 monographs coming our way in the not too distant future. What I love about your works is that not only do they, focus on predominantly niche subjects, and you give so much information, and you write in such a fun and exciting way that when you read them, it's just like you're right there with you, just discovering all this information. These books are full of detail and information, but it's not a dense text. Like those 600, 1,000 page volumes that can be a little bit tricky to get through sometimes. These are really easy to read, and they're not a challenge to get through. And it's accessible. That's what I love about these. I think they are accessible texts for people who are maybe even just getting into Disney history. They may appeal on a sort of maybe a broader spectrum to people who have read everything about Disney and just want to mine whatever they can. But I think they're accessible to even the most novice Disney history fan. And they're just so beautifully illustrated with hundreds of photos as well. There's a lot of text, but there's so many photos as well. And they're just such a joy to read and to experience. I imagine this would be a big part of it for you, making these texts accessible. And we're speaking about so many niche subjects here, and so many people that the people watching this may have never heard of, or but that accessibility of it, I imagine that's a big priority for you and the team at the.
That's absolutely critical for me, Dave. It needs to be fun. We need to have fun reading the text. There's nothing that I hate more than starting a book about history and finding it boring. In a book about history, I want to learn, but I want to have fun also. And so that's always the idea. There's a lot of information that I want to convey, but I also want people to absorb it in a fun way. And so all of the introductions, all of the conclusions needs to be fun, but then also the text itself needs to be fun. I was telling a friend of mine recently, he was saying, well, how do you do that? I'm like, well, there is a rule that I follow. Aside from having a really compelling introduction and a really compelling conclusion, the other rule is when I write a text, it needs to be two-thirds chocolate, one-third broccoli. And he says, what do you mean? I'm like, well, it's simple. If I have three paragraphs, then if there is one paragraph of broccoli, which is the paragraph where I'm conveying a lot of very specific information with dates and critical stuff that people need to know to understand the rest, but which is difficult to swallow and which is not as tasty from a pure enjoyment standpoint, then it needs to be followed by two paragraphs of chocolate. And he says, what do you mean by chocolate? I mean, well, really fun quotes and really fun anecdotes and really fun elements of information. Just thing that makes you think, huh, this is really fun. I didn't know that. And this is really cool. Or that is like, or when you're like, oh my God, what did they go through? And they're telling us about that in their own words. And this is just incredible. And so that's sort of the balance that I'm trying to keep always in those texts. And thank you for telling me that it works. That's the best compliment ever.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I love reading your works, and again, your fellow historians that you're working with as well all do such incredible works, and you could list them for days. And if anyone is still maybe perhaps a little bit hesitant to jump into the big monographs, the annuals are an incredible gateway to your work. These are easy to read. The articles are reasonably short, and they are just as fascinating as the monographs as well. Have you got a taste of perhaps what we can expect coming from the annuals over the coming years as well?
Sure, absolutely. So later this year, there will be another volume of the annual that's going to be coming up. And I can't, for the sake of me, I can't remember exactly what it will contain. I can tell you about two of the essays, which are the ones that I wrote, and I can't remember what the other ones are, but they're also going to be great. The two that I wrote, there is one about a polo team that was playing at the Walt Disney Studio called the Donald Duck Polo Team, and that was actually sent to Mexico in 1938. And the story of that polo team going to Mexico with those Disney artists is incredibly fun. And it's told through the perspective of several of the artists who were part of that team, Larry Landsberg, Mel Shaw, and there is at least one more artist that's Harry Title that tell us about that whole adventure in Mexico, and it's both a really fun little side note in Disney history and a really fun story, and unfortunately also a bit of a tragic story towards the end. And then in parallel to that, I also wrote an essay about a proposed collaboration between the Disney studio and a French studio in 1946, 1947, 1948. And that French studio was really the golden standard of animation studios in France at the time. It was sort of if you have in Japan the Studio Ghibli, you had in France at the time the Studio Les Gémeaux with Paul Grimaud as the big head of the studio, and Disney, because they had blocked funds in France at the time, the same way they then used those blocked funds to produce the first of the live action features in the UK, Treasure Island. They were thinking about producing some animation in France with that French studio, and there was a lot of work done on this, and storyboards developed, and there is a whole absolutely fascinating story that fills a really important gap in the history of Disney at the time. And I'm telling that story complete with a few photographs and storyboards and a lot of correspondence, obviously, from that time period. Some of it translated from the French, and so it's a really fun little story.
Amazing. I'm so excited.
Oh, and there is I remember now at least one of the other essay, which is by Todd James Pierce about the Celebrity Sports Center in Colorado that was owned by Walt for many years. And so he's telling us about the history of all of that in more detail than had ever been done before.
That's amazing. You are leaving no stones unturned. You are bringing in information from all, as I said, all different facets of the company and beyond. And I think it's just incredible. And I thank you for the work that you have done and your contemporaries have done as well. It really is just, as you say, revolutionizing not only Disney history but entertainment history, pop culture history, animation history. You are doing the greatest work for all these areas of, and to think it's 2024 and there's still such a trove of information coming out, and I think it's incredible. The annuals are available on Amazon very easily. I believe these are did they print these on demand, I think. So you order one and then they print one. The monographs are a little bit more tricky to get your hands on, particularly sort of in international. Can you tell people how to perhaps get their hands on the monographs?
Absolutely. So if you're based in the US or Canada, you should go through Stuart Ang Books. That's the best way to get them. If you aren't, there is a distributor based in Italy, if I'm not mistaken, which distribute throughout Europe, especially, and in a few other international countries. And for the sake of me, I can't remember the name of the distributor, but join the Disney History Institute Facebook group, and you will find the information there in quite a few places.
Yeah, I'll put all the information down there as well so people can click through and go and grab them. The great thing too is that a number of the True Life Adventures are actually on Disney Plus at the moment. I think pretty much all of them, unfortunately, except for Seal Island, are on there, and White Wilderness is not on there because I'm assuming because of the infamous Lemmings sequence. Yeah, so I think that's a great treasure trove as well. If you pick up the monograph, you are able to easily access the films, the True Life Adventures, because the physical copies, the DVDs, are well and truly out of print by now. Is there anything else you want to say on the True Life volume or any of your other work before we close this one out?
The only thing I'll add, for those of you who are following this program and who will be at D23, the Ultimate Fan event in August, the Hyperion Historical Alliance will have a booth at the event. The new monograph about Walt Disney and El Grupo in Latin America will be released at the time of the event. So I hope you'll come and visit us and get your autographed copies. And Ted Thomas, JB Kaufman, and myself will all be there.
That's so exciting. I'd love to get there one day. That's one of my goals, is to get to the D23 Expo. It looks great and you look like you have so much fun over there. I appreciate your time again today. You're always so wonderful to speak to and open and honest about all your work, and I love that. And again, I want to thank you again for all the incredible work that you're doing. I'd love to work with you on some level someday on something. Would be incredible. Yeah, for now, thank you again for this incredible work, and thank you for chatting with me today. It's been really appreciated. It's always fun to chat with you, and we will do it again very, very soon. We won't leave it another 6 years.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's absolutely always a pleasure.